It is such a pleasure and an honor to be participating in this program together with YCT Rabbinical School. Actually, the Torah that I'm going to present this evening goes back to the YCT Beit Midrash, back to probably 2003, 2004, when we were in the Ramat Orah building on 110th Street in Manhattan. I learned all of my halacha from Rabbi Linzer. I always turn to him for all of my halachic questions. But there was one teacher at Chovevei who really had a huge influence, a different teacher, Rabbi Dudi Goshen. He was not a full-time faculty member, but he came and taught certain special things like Agadita. And one of the things that he taught us was the Haggadah of Pesach. And it was really influenced me very much. Obviously, I've developed the ideas further. I've taught the Pesach Seder for about 15 years now that I've been a rabbi. Probably one of our go-to things that we go to as rabbis. So much learning around it. And this Torah goes back to the YCT Beit Midrash. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. And now one thing about the source sheet is that I actually have my topic is all about the 4 children. And one of the things that'll be a little bit challenging is that I was not able to figure out a way to get the Hebrew and the English in a way that you'll be able to see it on the same screen. But what I will do is I think the text will be provided afterwards. So sometimes I'll try to scroll down a little bit so you can actually see the English. But for the most part, I'm going to be hanging out here in the Hebrew text. One of the things about the Midrash of the Arba Banim, of the 4 children, I think from an emotional perspective, it really hits people in a deep way, because at least from my perspective, I'm sure others as well, I remember all of the Seders when I was a child, and we get up to the 4 children, and inevitably what happens is all of the children start thinking, okay, well, am I the Chacham? Am I the wise one? Well, which one of my siblings is the Rasha, is the evil one? And there's sort of this idea of like looking around at the table and who is who. And obviously that can be somewhat full of tension. And at least in my house, we would always have arguments over this. And really, why is the Rasha so bad, says the child that everybody assumed was the Rasha. So obviously it could be very emotionally tense. But one thing that I love to do when I study the Midrash of the 4 children, and I call it a Midrash because it really first appeared as a Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, and also in the Yerushalmi. So it was 2 Midrashim before it was brought into the Haggadah. When we study it, one of the things that happens with this Midrash of the 4 children is that the Haggadah rips the psukim out of their original context. It ignores, to a certain extent, what the psukim originally meant, and it gives its own spin on it. And what's fascinating, what we're going to do this evening in the brief time that I have, is we're going to compare the Midrash of the 4 children, primarily the one in our Haggadah Shal Pesach, with the version that you can find in the Yerushalmi. We'll take a little bit of a look at the Mechilta, but not as much. Primarily, we're going to compare these 2 texts over here. So we're going to jump right into it. On the full source sheet, which you will be provided, which you will have afterwards, we have all of the psukim here that are actually quoted in the Midrash of the 4 children. And I really encourage you to go back and look at each one. Just like Rabbi Katz said, if you were in Rabbi Katz's class, same thing. You have to go back and look at the original psukim. That would be a full hour class in order for us to do that. We're just going to sort of jump back and forth between the different texts. So the text begins, Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu, Baruch Shenasan Torah L'Amo Yisrael Baruch Hu. Blessed is the omnipresent, blessed is God. Blessed is the one who gave the Torah to the Jewish people. What does this sound like? This sounds almost like a Birchas HaTorah, a blessing of the Torah, because the context in the middle of the Haggadah, by the way, just one word about the Haggadah, I like to use this very, very simple Haggadah. I don't even know what you call it. It's very similar to the Maxwell House Haggadah. This is the Haggadah that I like to use. It is very straightforward. A lot of people like to use the Haggadahs with all the different commentaries. From my perspective, that's what you're supposed to do before you come to the Seder. That's the pre-Seder. But the Seder itself, I'm a fan of using a very simple text that basically just has the text of the Haggadah itself, and then the questions and the commentary is supposed to be what happens, of course, at the table. But anyways, in the context of the Haggadah, the Maggid basically begins with the 4 questions. we ask, why is tonight special? We start with the first answer of Abadim Hayinu. We have this whole idea of we're really supposed to be Marbel L'Saper. We're supposed to say it as much as we can. And this leads us to the idea of the rabbis in Bnei Brak. But then in order to basically explain or to jump off from a very important line in the Mishnah in Arvei Pesachim, which says, Lefi daito shel ben aviv milamdo, which means based on the knowledge of the child, that's how you're supposed to give the answer. Meaning the Mishnah, already back in Mishnaic times, there was a recognition that different people at the Seder learn in different ways, which already points us to the idea that, and Rabbi Katz hinted at this in the class, at least that I was at, that there really is not only one Seder at around the dining room table. Really, there are as many Seders as people who are there. Every single person really, in a certain sense, needs their own Seder because the text and the questions and the answers need to speak to that person. And that's why we have Kineged Arba Banim Dibra Torah. The Torah speaks to 4 children. Echad Chacham, Echad Rasha, Echad Tam, Vechad She'enu Yodei Lishal. One is the Chacham, one is the Rasha, the evil one, the wise one, the evil one, the Tam, the simple one, and the one who doesn't know how to ask questions. Those are the 4. So already, the reason why I gave you this synoptic chart of the texts is to look back and forth. Already, do we have any differences between the 3 versions? Well, the Mechilta and the Haggadah, if you're looking at the text, are almost exactly the same. But there's one very big difference in the Yerushalmi, which maybe some of you noticed. It said there are 4 children. You have the Ben Chacham, the wise one, the Ben Rasha, the evil one, but then instead of saying the Tam, the simple one, what does it say? Ben Tipesh, the foolish one. It is much more negative. The Yerushalmi goes very negative, but that's going to be very interesting. Just hold that thought for 1 second. And now we jump into the first of the 4 children. Chacham Mahu Omer. What does the Chacham say? Ma ha'edus v'hachukim v'hamishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu eschem. This is a quote from a pasuk from Devarim, which we're going to see inside in just a second. But the pasuk means, Ma, what are these statutes, these testimonies, these laws that Hashem, our God, has commanded you? That's the question of the Ben Chacham, of the wise child. And what's the answer? Let's look at the answer, but then we're going to go right into the psukim to see how the Torah handles the same question. The answer is, V'af ata emorlo, you should tell the child, Kihilchot haPesach. Tell him the laws of Passover. In other words, let's teach him some halacha. Let's get into the practical laws and how they're actually lived out in real life and real experience based on the Shulchan Aruch. Ein maftirin achar Pesach atikomen, as this is oftentimes explained, even teach the very last halacha that you do not have any food after the Korban Pesach or after the Afikoman. This originally, those of you learning Daf Yomi, we learned this a few weeks ago, was referring to the Korban Pesach. After you're done eating the meat of the lamb or the goat of the Korban Pesach, that has to be the last thing in your mouth. You can't have anything else. But the bottom line is, it seems like an insignificant detail, but the idea is you have to teach the child who is the Chacham the very last law. In other words, when you read the Chacham, both the question and the answer, what is important in terms of knowledge? What does the Chacham want to know? Another way to ask this question is this first word, ma, right? What does the word ma actually mean? There are 2 possibilities. It could either mean, what are the laws and the statutes? Meaning, what are they? Tell me the halachot. Tell me the laws. Tell me what I want to follow. God, tell me to jump. I'm just going to ask you how high. This is all about law. It's very legal. That's the ma. Ma can mean what? What are the actual laws? That's one way. But another question that could be asked in this context is really lima, which means for what? Not what, but why. Why are we doing all of this? What's the point? What's the reason, right? It could be one of 2 questions. Well, let's look at the Haggadah, right? According to the Haggadah, based on the answer that we give to the Chacham, we should be able to figure out what the question is. So what's the answer? The answer is, you should tell him the laws. So obviously, that means that the question was a what question? The Chacham asked, what should I do? And you tell the Chacham, here's what you should do. In other words, in the Haggadah's version, and this is also true in the Mechilta, the question ma, and what wisdom is really all about is what am I supposed to do? That's what we have here. Now I want to jump back and look in the original psukim. Are the original psukim also going in that same direction? Or maybe the Baal Haggadah, the one who authored the Haggadah, and when does the Haggadah come in? It doesn't really come into the Gaonic period in the 8th or 9th century. But let's see what was there originally in the psukim. So I'm going to go way up in my source sheet to the original context of the question that we attribute to the Chacham, right? But here it is in its original source. It comes from Devarim chapter 6. And it says, Ki shalcha bincha machar lemor. When your child will ask you tomorrow, meaning after you go into the land of Israel, generations later, your child will ask you, Ma ha'edut v'hachukim v'hamishpatim asher tzivah Hashem Elokeinu eschem. What are all of these laws that God has commanded you? Now, I want to point out, what is the context? This is Devarim chapter 6. If you just go back a little bit in the Torah, we don't have time to look at it inside, but in chapter 5, begins with this idea that Moshe tells the people, look, Hashem gave the Torah not to your ancestors, but to you. And then afterwards, we literally have the 10 commandments right before, just a few verses before, and all of the laws and all of the Torah. So when it says here, Ki shalcha bincha machar lemor, when your child will ask you tomorrow saying, what are these laws? It's actually not even talking about Pesach at all. Really, what is the question? The question is, what are the laws of the Torah? Or actually not what, but it's really limma. It means, why are we doing all of these laws? This is basically the basic question that any teenager will ask the parents at a certain point. Mom, Dad, why are we doing all of these things? Why do I have to be Jewish? Why do I have to be from? Why do I have to be Orthodox? That's essentially this question. Ki shalcha bincha. What's my proof that that's the question, that it's a why question and not a what question? Because look at the answer. The answer is, v'amarta levincha. It doesn't say you should say to your children, Ein maftir na'achar Pesach atikom, and here, child, let me teach you some halacha. Let's open up the Gemara. Let's open up the Shulchan Aruch. Let's learn some Jewish law. That's not the answer in the Torah, of course. What's the answer? The Amarta Levincha. This verse should sound very familiar to you. Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. You know why you have to do everything? Because we were slaves. Son, daughter, let me teach you a lesson. Way back when we were slaves and God took us out. Of course, we're very familiar with this because this is the very beginning of the first answer. And Hashem took us out with great wonders. And God took us out from there in order to bring us to this wonderful land. So that's why we have to do all of it. Meaning it's a very, very different definition of wisdom. The wisdom in the Haggadah, or the definition of who is wise, is the child who asks a very specific kind of question. It's the very frum child, the child who wants to be scrupulous in his or her halachic observance, the child who wants to know the last detail of what we have to do to get Pesach perfectly right, the child who has those measurements at the Seder to know exactly what's a kizayis, how much matzah, the what. That's what that child's interested. That's what the chacham is in the Haggadah. But in the Torah, ironically, the chacham asked a very different question. What was the question that the chacham asked in the Torah? It doesn't really say chacham. The question was a why question. Why are we doing it? That's very interesting, a very, very different idea. Now, this is why it gets really interesting to compare the different versions. Because if you look over at the Yerushalmi, at the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, the question is exactly the same. Ben chachamau omer, ma edus v'achukim v'mishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu osanu. Actually, there's one difference. Instead of saying eschem, it says osanu. Also in the Mechilta, it says osanu. And I'm sorry for those of you who are not able to follow along in the Hebrew, but you'll get the text afterwards with all the translations. So that's actually a very interesting difference, the word otanu, okay? There are lots of things. The Septuagint might have actually had a different version of the text. And also, by the way, this answers a very profound question that many people ask. What did the Rasha ask that's so problematic? The Rasha says, Moha avoda azos lachem. What is this service that you have? And we get very angry at the Rasha. We say, lachem v'lo lo. He takes himself out of the community. Well, doesn't the Chacham also say eschem? He also says you. So in the version of the Yerushalmi, first of all, it solves that problem. It ignores the text, but it does solve the problem by saying the word osanu. It actually doesn't ignore the text. If you look at the text very carefully, there actually is the word osanu there, but we probably will not have time to develop that idea. But I'm more interested in the answer. What's the answer that we give the Chacham? We don't give the answer to the Chacham of, you know what? The answer to your question, the wisdom that you're looking for is, here's all the halacha. Let's open up the Shulchan Aruch and teach you law. You should get smicha. You should become a rabbi. That's not the answer. You know what the answer is? You should tell him a why answer. Why are we doing all of the mitzvos? It's because Hashem took us out. That's an answer to a why question. What's so interesting, and I wish we could talk, but I know you can't unmute yourself. What's so interesting here is that this answer that we give to the Chacham in the Yerushalmi, we actually in the Haggadah give that answer to somebody else. Who do we give that answer to? We give that answer to the Tam. Word for word. The same answer that we give to the Tam in the Haggadah is what we give to the Chacham in the Yerushalmi. And the reversal happens also when it comes down to here. Look at the Tam. We're not going to have time to look at the Rasha, I don't think. Tam, what does he say? Everyone's very familiar with this. Mazos, that's why it's a simple question. It doesn't have any complexity to it. What is this? And you should say, Bechozek Yad Hotzianu Hashem Mitzrayim, because Hashem took us out. So according to the Baal Haggadah, Mazos, why do we do this? The simple one asks the why question. To ask a why question, according to the Haggadah, which is a very rabbinic text, is a why question. That's what a simple person asks. Why do we do this? It's a very simple question. And you give them a little history. Oh, because God took us out, so therefore we have some sort of a responsibility to God. But look over in the Yerushalmi. First of all, I pointed out before that the Yerushalmi refers to the Tam as a tipesh, the foolish one. It's much harsher. And look what it says. Ma'o Omer. Mazos, he asked the same question, but what's the answer that we give to the Tam? Af at limdo hilchos ha-pesach. You should teach him the laws. What do you do with the simple one who the Yerushalmi is calling the foolish one? You open up the Shulchan Aruch. That's all the Tam wants to know. He wants to know the halacha. It's this halacha, this detailed halacha. We learned about in Daf Yomi also, that after you're done eating or while you're eating your afikoman, you're not allowed to take your food from one group to another group. People have a hard time understanding what's going on here, but the Karban Pesach had to be in Yerushalayim. There were millions of people, according to the Talmud, who were in Yerushalayim doing the Karban Pesach, and you had to actually eat it within the walls of a city. So you could imagine every possible open space in Yerushalayim. There was a chabura, there was a group of people that were eating a Karban Pesach. So probably you didn't see people since last year, and you're in the middle of eating your Karban Pesach, and then you see, oh, your friend Yankel down there is over there. They say, hey, Yankel, I miss you. And you take your food over and you go speak to them. The halacha is you're not allowed to do that. You have to finish your food within your chavura, within your group. But the bottom line is that the Yerushalmi is giving to the Tam, to the simple one, the same answer that we gave to the wise one. It's amazing. Two different definitions of what wisdom is, okay? According to the Haggadah, what does it mean to be wise? It means, to ask a wise question means to try to figure out what the halacha is. This is a very, very specific kind of child. We all know with our children, we have some children, some children are the ones who are very interested in knowing exactly how to do it, in what way, how to please the adults in the room. That's one definition of being wise. Learning all the halakha. That's very important in terms of mitzvah observance. How should we please Hashem? How should we be part of this process? And the Haggadah is saying that's the wise child. That one is being, if you will, centered, or the one that the kind of wisdom that's being knowledge, that's being centered, that's being prioritized. The Tam who asked the wise question, the why question, that's not as important. But within the Yerushalmi, it's exactly opposite. The Yerushalmi actually gives the wise child the question of why. That child, who we sometimes think is the rebel, is asking the question which is too difficult, perhaps maybe is not being compliant enough or conforming enough. Actually, in the words of the Yerushalmi, that is the child that we are favoring in terms of what Chachma is. So it's very wild. I mean, I just want to point out one other big, interesting difference. Everyone struggles with what's wrong with the Rasha's question. The Rasha says, what is this service for you? And I encourage you to go back and look at the psukim themselves. But the question is, what's bad about the Rasha's question? I mean, by the way, when you read the psukim, there is no indication that there's anything wrong at all with the question. But when you do look at the psukim, you will see that the question of the Rasha is actually going on the sacrifice of the Karban Pesach. The way that it actually worked is that in what's called Pesach Mitzrayim, that original Pesach, what did they do? They slaughtered the animal. They took some hyssop, they dipped it in the blood, and then they smeared that on the doorpost, right? And that's why Hashem was Pasach, passed over. God passed over based on that idea. But that's a pretty dramatic thing. When you look at the pshat of the psukim in Shmos chapter 12, it actually seems that even after the Jewish people go into the land of Israel, they're actually supposed to bring the Karban Pesach at their homes and do that same thing, dip the blood around the doors. It's only when you look at Devarim, which is very much about Makom Asher Yivchar Hashem, the place that God will choose. It's all very Beis HaMikdash focused. That's where we get the idea that the Karban Pesach actually has to be brought in Yerushalayim. But the simple explanation of the Rasha's question is, what is this service? There's nothing wrong. He just saw something pretty crazy. He saw his parents slaughter an animal, take some hyssop, dip it in the blood, and put it on the doorpost. It makes sense that he would say, have you lost your mind? Moav, what are you doing? What's the problem? The Yerushalmi explains what the problem is. The Rasha, what does he say? It adds a few words. What is this burden that you burden upon us every year? So the Rasha's question, it's actually, he's not the one who did anything wrong. It's because the parents, for some reason, allowed it to come over that it's a burden. They didn't give it with a sense of simcha, with a sense of joy. But the point is, you see a little more from the Rasha. But when you do this synoptic chart, it's a great way of actually figuring out what the texts are saying, what's important about each text. And actually, I would say more importantly, when you compare it to the original context in the psukim, which are on the source sheet, which you'll be provided afterwards, you really appreciate what the Haggadah does, what the Yerushalmi does, what the Mechilta does. But the lesson, again, that I want to leave you with is that what we learn from here, it's not only that there are 4 children, even within each child, there are different definitions of what wisdom is. For example, is the wise child asking the question, why do we do this? The teenager who says, I don't get this. Why do we do everything? Or is the wise child the one who's saying, tell me what to do. I want to know everything. I want to know every single halacha. 2 different definitions of wisdom. So when we're at our Seder, as I started with, we have as many Seders as people there. Even if we're at a Seder by ourselves, by the way, which happened last year. I don't know if it'll still happen this year, probably for some people. The idea is you're still supposed to ask yourself the questions, and you're supposed to see all of these 4 ideas within yourself, and you're also supposed to see the different definitions of wisdom, the different definitions of what it means to struggle, sometimes being simple, sometimes being rebellious. All of those things come in there. So I encourage everybody to channel all of those aspects, make sure everyone who's at the Seder is to be able to be addressed. And obviously it's all about the preparation. You prepare for the Seder based on the people who are there. And I want to wish everybody a Chag Kosher v'Sameach. Thank you so much for allowing me to participate here.